So why talk about this? Well, if you look at most reports about implementation of AI in industries and governments, there are three main challenges in implementing AI systems. It's whether you have the people, the skills, whether you have the money, and whether you can actually control the behavior of AI systems. So that's governance, that's the fancy word for it. And just to give you a couple of examples, there were already some high-profile cases where companies and even government agencies got fined because their models didn't work correctly or didn't work as advertised. You may know Trivago, which is a hotel booking site. They actually were fined almost 50 million Australian dollars for promising in TV commercials that their algorithms provide you with the best rates, whereas their algorithms actually were optimized for promoting higher paid offers by certain resellers. And they got fined for that as a result of violating consumer trust. Government agencies also get fined. The Dutch tax authority got fined a couple of years ago for a couple of different things under the GDPR rules. For example, for excessive data use, for modeling, for building models that were biased against a certain subset of the population, and also for building models that didn't actually work properly. So they got fined for that. Deliveroo, which is not that popular in Poland, I think, or maybe not even exists in Poland, but it's popular. It's a food delivery service, popular in Western countries. They got fined as well for building models that were not transparent enough. So riders issued complaints when it comes to how their orders and how their work shifts were organized. And they also got fined for a couple of different things, such as excessive data use, data retention, and so on. So this is a real problem. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Most researchers and startups cannot afford an army of lawyers to support that, to support their work. Even if people do have some legal training, and they often don't, then the field evolves so quickly, especially this year, that it's just hard to keep up. And if you participated in the panel earlier today, the generative AI panel, you could even hear that from some of the speakers that they were not sure how to interpret some of the rules. So that just shows you that there's a lot of work, a lot of education that needs to happen. And this is why you're here. So thanks for taking this time for learning about this. I'm not a lawyer, so don't treat this as legal advice. Don't treat it as my company's legal stance. I'm just here to have this discussion with you. I'm also open to any challenges you may have. I'm also open to learning from you. I'll give you some ideas and some thoughts, and don't treat it as a clear-cut answer. If you ask any lawyer, by the way, if you haven't worked with lawyers, you will like lawyers because they operate similar to developers. They always, when you ask them something, they tell you it depends. Most just like a regular developer. So you'll love working with lawyers. If you don't work with them yet, establish a relationship. Some companies can afford lawyers, but just ask around. They are probably somewhere there. It's just that you haven't started working with them yet. So they will always they need to help you and establish what your use case is, what the context is, what the jurisdiction is, and so on. All right, so let's start with license. We'll cover three things: licenses for models and data and software, and copyright for input-output of models, and then upcoming regulations, which will make our lives even more difficult, or easy sometimes. You may have seen cases like that. I see that on the regular. You go up on LinkedIn and someone says, I found this new cool piece of open source software, or even not open source, just like free software. And people are like, yeah, let's download it, let's use it. But they don't look at the tiny print which says terms and conditions and whether you can actually use that software commercially. It's not enough for you to be able to download the software for free. You have to actually check whether you can use it. In this case, this is a case that actually my team were faced with last week, because someone posted this, and I was quick to spot that we can actually use it at the company. Because if you scroll down to the page, there are actually two helpful buttons there, not even terms and conditions, but also can you actually use it at work? And it says, well, no, contact us for license. That's the only thing that the page says. And even if you go to the license itself, just like look up commercial in any license, it's actually quite easy. There's a lot of legal text, but the clauses about commercial use are actually quite usually quite short and easy to understand. If not, use a large language model to summarize it for you. It's usually out there. It's plain to understand. There are some cases where there's an open source tool, and some of you maybe even use tools like that. Anaconda distribution is one case, where they're open source, but that doesn't mean that they are free for commercial use. In fact, you sometimes even have to read closely, like in this case, how commercial use is defined. In the case of Anaconda, you can be a startup of 150 developers, up to 200 developers actually. Every single developer in your startup can use it, and that's non-commercial use, so you can do it. But then if you hire one more person, it's now 201 employees and they all use it, that's really commercial use. You need a separate license for that. So you need to look out for cases like that. And you usually have a dedicated legal team in a big company like mine that does this for you. And that's also why software is managed at large companies. So you cannot just install whatever you want. But in startups and other companies, it's on you, on developers, to actually own this decision. Okay. You probably haven't seen cases like that before, but if you don't read the terms and conditions, you could actually get in trouble. This doesn't happen that often, at least you don't hear about it that often, because companies and institutions and governments manage that in-house. It's not something you want to post on the front page of the New York Times. Companies like to just, treat it internally, but this happens. So Gartner, in one survey, noticed that about 70% of companies get audited by a software vendor at least once per year. So this can happen if a company just approaches you and says, well, they will issue a notice and say, we would like to audit your machines, please, on site. Sometimes it's accompanied by a long, threatening letter. If you say, I don't want to do it, then they will start pushing, and this will happen sooner or later. You can also have whistleblowers who like open source software, and they will actually point to their own company saying, well, this company is breaking civil law in terms of conditions. Some companies actually use, self-disclose this and kind of self-incriminate them by posting, putting comments as to which particular software they use in their code that they put on GitHub, or they mentioned openly at conferences like this one. So there are various sort of causes for how a data breach could be found out. And if they do find it out, if the vendor finds out that you breached terms and conditions, then a lot of bad things can happen, and your company will lose a lot of money. You could potentially lose your job, or there are also other consequences that could happen. So let's assume that you found a piece of software, such as a large language model, which is a case that was popular this year, and it says it's not for commercial purpose, but it's for research purposes. And you're a researcher, you do R&D, but then you work at a commercial for-profit company. What do you do then? So this is something that I witnessed a couple of times this year. You remember that when LLMs became the big thing recently, when Meta released Llama V1, they open sourced it in February. They initially only granted access to model weights on a case-by-case basis to researchers and academics. But then soon it got leaked onto GitHub and everyone could download it. As you know now, if you can download it, doesn't mean you can use it. But people actually started using it. I remember a couple of weeks after that happened, I went to an ML conference in Poznań, where I'm based. And there was this Poznań-based software development house that presented at the conference like this their chatbot based on Llama V1, openly saying they used it. The challenge is that commercial use isn't actually defined that well. It also depends on your jurisdiction, on your purpose of why you're using software, of what your context is, whether you are employed by an organization which is for-profit or non-profit. But generally, I can give you this rule of thumb. Always confirm it with your lawyers. If it's for money, or if it's for fame, or for advantage commercially, then it'll probably be classified as commercial use. So in the case of that company that I mentioned, that was a project that was commissioned to them by a government organization, but they got money for this, and they also presented it at a conference, which could be treated as commercial advantage because they are software house, they depend on events like this one. So that could have probably been, if Meta got to know about it, they could have, fined them for breaching terms and conditions of model. And actually for using Meta's property, the model, to which they got access, and they shouldn't have gotten access to it because access was regulated. So this can happen also if you're an actual researcher at an academic institution. If that institution engages in commercial activities, if they, for example, get funding from private entities, or if they organize some sort of training that people pay for, that is already some context in which that could be sort of interpreted as commercial use of a model like this one. So be careful. Okay, so let's assume you found a model or a piece of software or a data set that can be used commercially. Great. And now I want you to ask yourself this question, like, what else do you want to be able to do with this apart from using it? Do you want to be able to modify it? Because you have to read the terms and conditions whether you can actually modify it. If you want to be able to distribute it, there may be some clauses that mention that you have to distribute it on the same license that you got the model on. Do you want to patent it? Because there are some licenses that are quite similar. It's just the MIT license and the Apache 2 license. Whereas the MIT license is good, but it doesn't mention patents at all because it's quite old. So some interpretations suggest that actually you cannot patent stuff that uses the MIT license. So you cannot patent an application that used software made available to you on the MIT license. There are other use cases like this when it comes to LLMs, the big thing these days. There are LLMs that are distributed on very permissive licenses, such as Falcon. You can do pretty much everything with them. But then you have to go to the acceptable use policy and see which things you cannot do with them. So for example, for Falcon, you can build applications on top of it. You can do all sorts of stuff. The one thing you cannot do, for example, is host it and sell it to others as a vanilla API. That's one thing the terms and conditions say you cannot do. So you just cannot resell Falcon as a service unless you've modified it and built an app out of it. I'm not saying you have to open source your work. That depends on your goals. There are some cases when you want to keep a trade secret or patent some work, sure. But just based on what we just discussed, remember that open sourcing your work doesn't automatically mean that others can use it, especially if you care about open science. Open sourcing your work is often not enough for people to actually be able to use it. You often have to use a commercial license. You can use a copyleft license, if you like, where people have to reshare the work if they use your work. That's fine. And also remember that there are other specific licenses for data sets, such as this one that we sometimes use when we publish data sets. Always check that. All right, let's talk about copyright for data input and output. This became a thing recently. There was a series of articles investigating what's in the Books 3 data set. Meta, Eluther, Bloomberg, they used that for a couple of years now, but it was only recently that people actually, journalists, looked at what's in that data set. And we know that data set came from a pirated source. There were books in there which were unlawfully accessed and were copyrighted. No one really paid attention up until recently. And the question is, can you actually use copyrighted books or any other data to build a model? The answer is actually, surprisingly, in many cases, yes. That depends on the jurisdiction, as usual. So there are countries in the world which allow you to do this under what's called TDM, which is an exception for copyright use for text and data mining. These are provisions usually dating from the early 2000s when big data was a thing. And these provisions were about mining data for patterns and insights. They weren't specifically designed for generative AI, so this may change. But as of today, you can actually do it in certain jurisdictions. The EU also has, as of 2019, a dedicated copyright directive that mentions exceptions like this, especially for science, but also for other use cases, unless the person who owns the copyright opts out. Which is very problematic, because if you scrape your website on Monday, Do you need to check on Tuesday, Wednesday, and any other day until the end of the world whether they actually opt out suddenly? Because they can opt out at any moment. They can do it right away after you've scraped it, and at that point you need to delete that data because they opted out. So this provision is quite problematic, and it's quite problematic to enforce in Europe. Great. This directive is the equivalent of the GDPR, so it needs to have regional implementations. Poland is past the deadline to implement it. We had 2 years to do it. We still haven't, because this guy had some objections, which were actually quite sound. Didn't really pertain to TDM, but other cases. So we still don't have the RODO equivalent of this, but we will. So you will know more about it soon. In the US, and these are what all the high-profile law cases are about, there's a thing called fair use. Google Books was the big example from a couple of years ago, where the decision was, in the end, by the Supreme Court, that even if you take a book, but you transform it, so you make it into a searchable database of keywords, then that's transformative use, which makes it a fair use of copyright. And this is the defense that OpenAI and others are now using. As you know, it's still unclear, and there's more regulations coming up soon in the US and worldwide, which will be adapted to generative AI specifically. But as of now, it's sort of unclear, but probably leaning towards it's okay to use copyright material to train models. When it comes to models provided to you by big tech companies, so Meta, well, not yet Meta, but Microsoft and Google, they recently added those provisions that they will take care, if anyone sues you for copyright, they will take care of those court cases. That pertains both to copyrighted model training data and also output. So if the output of the model, for some reason, if someone says the output that you produced using a Google model or a Microsoft model that infringes on someone else's copyright, then you can phone Google and say, take care of this, and they will. This is a case that I see often when people say, oh, we use GPT to generate some labels. As you probably know, that's not allowed by the terms and conditions. Pretty much across the board, there are some companies that allow that. Again, Falcon is a good model, which is very permissive. You can pretty much do anything with it. And by now, you also know probably that cases like Alpaca are like double whammy, double trouble, because they use Llama v1, which is, you cannot use that for commercial purposes, and they will also fine-tuned on GPT-3 outputs. That's like double trouble in terms of terms and conditions. Web scraping may change soon as well. So there are calls from international data privacy regulators reminding people that even if people put data online, it's still private data. Even if it's public, it's still provisions according to data privacy apply. So there's a lot of talk about how social media companies should change, how data can be scraped, how to educate customers, whether web scraping should maybe be treated as a data breach in itself. TBD, but something to look out for. And finally, model output is really challenging. You may have heard about the case where the monkey took a selfie, and that cannot be copyrighted because copyright doesn't apply to, well, it only applies to humans. So a machine or a monkey cannot be granted copyright. The same pretty much applies to model output. Tools such as Midjourney are not considered tools that authors use. So if someone uses Midjourney or any other model like that, doesn't really matter what they do, they will need to substantially change the output in order to be granted copyright. And the same applies to text and code. If you take verbatim output of an LLM or a codex model, you cannot get copyright for that, which is problematic. If you write code, you want to own the code, you want to get copyright for code, you'll have to probably label the stuff you wrote versus the stuff that the machine wrote, so that you can show to the copyright body which particular aspects were, how much you modified the AI's output. Real quick, regulations, because that's sort of coming up still, so we still have some time to get used to this. There's a tidal wave of regulations just returned from China yesterday, where I spoke to a couple of developers who are really frustrated by the new, very, very strict regulations. Other regulations are coming up in the EU. A lot of that is kind of already regulated by the GDPR, but there's a new regulation coming up, the EU AI Act, which you may have heard about. Other countries are also setting up their own regulations, even within the EU. The one thing you should know about the EU AI Act is that it's a risk-based framework. So depending on what you do, which industry you work for, which use cases you work for, there will be certain provisions that apply to what you do. So in my case, education is a high risk. So there are a couple of sets of provisions that we'll have to work with when it comes to releasing an education product that uses AI. We'll have to write documentation, make sure data we use for models is not copyrighted, have certain risk processes. We'll need to have that CE mark that each product that is allowed to be used in the EU gets. So there's a lot of hoops we'll have to go through. That may not apply to you, but it may, and it's coming. So get ready for that, especially if you now are choosing between LLMs, for example. An open source LLM that uses open data is far more likely to meet these stringent requirements than a closed proprietary LLM. Okay, we're wrapping up things we're not going to cover today. There are many things I haven't mentioned. It's just data transfers. So if you have customers in the EU, but you transfer data to the US, or upcoming ideas such as sandboxes, so certain processes for you to pilot an AI model in an industry before you even are allowed to release it. This is what's happening in the US with autonomous vehicles and the robotaxis. There are many things I haven't focused. I'm happy to continue this discussion either here at the conference or in Poznań, where I'm based. We organize meetups very frequently, so come join us next time you're in Poznań. Also find me online. And if I can leave you with one thing, for Monday morning, once you get back from this conference, look up on your intranet whether there's a lawyer in-house. There probably is, like a paralegal maybe, like a legal counsel. Talk to them, establish that relationship. That will come in handy sooner than you think. And like I said, the lawyers will be very happy to talk to you. They are great people, and you may need their help sooner than later. Thanks so much for taking time to educate yourselves about it, and let's open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you.